The third themed session, Talk and Taboo, and as I'm sure you're all aware, it's on how the Australian linguistic landscape has changed since Donald Horne's lucky country. Now we've got a cracking good panel here today, and what I'll do is introduce each of them as they come up to present, so that way you don't have to keep four people in your head. There are four, sorry. Jackie is joining us online at the end. So the first speaker is Amanda Laugerson, and Amanda is a fantastic blend of lexicographer and historian. So she is the director of the Australian National Dictionary Centre here at the ANU. She is the chief editor of the Australian National Dictionary. But she also, of course, researches in history, cultural history, particularly the cultural history of war, history of Australian English, history of the book and publishing. Her most recent book, and that reminds me to remind you that there is in fact an exhibition of books over the road at the Harry Hartog, is that right, the right name? Yes, so let's hope it's got Amanda's book in there, which is Australia in 100 Words. So that is a lovely collection of uniquely Australian expressions and their life story. But I have to say my favourite book of yours, Amanda, is still Rooted, Australia's History of Bad Language. And I'm sure that's everyone's favourite, actually. Now, I haven't got your title. I was going to bring it with me. But anyway, please welcome Amanda.
Okay, so I'm going to be the experimental person doing the PowerPoint and hoping it moves forward, since we haven't actually had a PowerPoint in this yet. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and on which I live and work here in the ACT, the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So here we go. Let's see if we can get this. 2 clicks, no clicks. Right, okay. So I'd actually like to begin my talk by showing you our draft entry for acknowledgement of country, which for various reasons wasn't in, I don't know the reasons, wasn't in the 2016 edition of the Australian National Dictionary, but was recently included in our dictionary. So what is the Australian National Dictionary? Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might be less familiar with it. The Australian National Dictionary is a record of the words and expressions that make up what we might call kind of standard or general variety, Australian variety of English. Its subtitle is Australian Words and Their Origins. It's a dictionary on historical principles. It's modelled on the Oxford English Dictionary, which tends to get a lot more publicity and attention than our dictionary does. And that basically means that for each entry, as you would have seen with the acknowledgement of country entry that I showed you, we provide an explanation for the origin of a particular word or expression, a definition, of course, but most importantly, a set of quotations that tracks the use of a word from its first recorded use through to more recent usages of a word. And so if you're not familiar with the Australian National Dictionary, you'll probably have looked at the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's essentially modelled on the same principles, same methodology. So collectively, these entries, and we only include words that are uniquely Australian, are first used here or have a special meaning here or which have some kind of special significance. And if you see there, that's just our criteria that was drafted by the first editor of the Australian National Dictionary, Bill Ramsden. Our first edition came out in 1988. So collectively, what this dictionary does is to tell a story of Australia. Acknowledgement of country is just one of the new entries that we've been working on and that have gone into the dictionary since the second edition was published in 2016. Just to give you a bit of a flavour, some of the new entries, and I'll show more new entries near the end of my talk, include Abatesque, Bachelor's Handbag, Giggle Chicken, Quiet Australian, Robo-Debt, and Yarning Circle, just to give you a bit of a sense of the breadth of what we put in. Now, it's true to say that our idea of Australian English, or the Australian English lexicon, has been closely identified with a sense of national identity, particularly across the 20th century. When Sidney Baker wrote his popular book, The Australian Language, in 1945, the first edition came out in 1945. And here I acknowledge the fact that the term Australian language is a fraught one. We tend to not use it to describe the Australian variety of English these days because it's more appropriately used to refer to First Nations languages and usually used in the plural as Australian languages. But Baker's book was an attempt at establishing what we might think of as a kind of linguistic independence for Australia. His account, based on his collection of words and expressions that he collected through public contributions, that he solicited through newspapers, correspondence with Australian writers such as Kylie Tennant and Ernestine Hill, as well as the reading of various books, magazines, and newspapers, was an attempt by Baker to tell a story of the language that, in his words, showed it to be the blood beat of everyday life. And he believed that a study of the Australian language will help us see the Australian in the round. Now, most people in most public perceptions of Australian English at the time, and really since, tend to equate Australian English and Australian slang and colloquialisms. At the time, there were mixed views, so it's books coming out in 1945. There were mixed views on such language. On the one hand, the Australian variety of English offered a source of cultural distinctiveness, celebrated, for example, in the Bulletin early in the 20th century, used, or at least seen to be used, by the Australian archetypal men, and the story was often a very masculine one, such as the bushman and the digger, of course. In the interwar period, though, this language also found its way into the literary writing of women, and I think this is a story that tends to perhaps get overlooked in favour of the more sort of masculinist archetypal ones. And in fact, Sidney Baker's daughter wrote her honours thesis on the fact that Sidney left out these women who were kind of central to his collection of language, because he had this lengthy correspondence with people like Kylie Tennant, and they in fact had helped to provide much of the stuff, but got fairly short shrift in the book itself. At the time also, of course, in terms of the way in which Australian English was kind of providing a sense of national identity for Australians, this was set in opposition to the imported slang that was coming in from the United States. And of course, it was US slang that was seen to be the kind of thing to be worried about. It was undermining morals, it was undermining identity here in Australia. Baker's book is perhaps most important in terms of its kind of cultural influence, I guess, in terms of giving this emerging and very much a white male mythos of Australian English a distinctive articulation. If Australian English is a marker of a certain type, and perhaps more importantly, a performance of national identity, it has always got also a hint of ambivalence about it. And interestingly, I looked up what Donald Horne had to say about Australian English in his book, in The Lucky Country. So this is about the only quote that I could find where he was explicitly talking about the language. There has been a special raciness of style that is taken to be peculiarly Australian, yet much of this Australian language, and note he puts it in quotation marks, is simply city slang or provincial idiom or even thieves' cant brought over from England during the settlement. He also went on to argue that mateship, bush ballads and the Australian laconic style were all derivative of England, and I think that was mentioned as well this morning, that he sort of saw Australian culture as being largely derivative. Now, it is true to say that some of those things do make up the Australian English lexicon, as we know. Now, When Bill Ramsden came to write his PhD thesis, which was published as Australian English and Historical Study of the Vocabulary, this came out just 2 years, it was published by ANU Press, as it was back then, just 2 years after Donald Horne's Lucky Country. And I don't know if Ramsden and Horne ever spoke about Australian English at the time. So it comes out in 1966. This was the same year that a revised edition of Sidney Baker's book, The Australian Language, appeared, published in a popular press. Needless to say, I think Baker got a lot more sales and readers than Bill Ramsden's book of his thesis. But in this book, Bill argued that Australian English was an offshoot of the British English vocabulary. He was largely dismissive of Baker's preoccupations with slang, and instead what he wanted to demonstrate was that Australian English was essentially an extension of the British English vocabulary and was the vocabulary of an English settler colonial society. And this would go on to inform his work on the Australian National Dictionary. So Bill worked alongside Arthur Delbridge and others who went on to work on the Macquarie Dictionary. His work informed that. But then he went off to work specifically on the Australian National Dictionary. But all of these dictionary projects at the time, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, were essentially part of a push to create Australian dictionaries for an Australian audience, for Australian users, to legitimate the variety of English here. And of course, the Macquarie Dictionary's first edition, which came out in 81 or 82, was hugely influential, popular, a real cultural moment where it was seen that the Australian variety of English had reached a kind of maturity and a recognition that it hadn't had to this point. Now, the Australian National Dictionary was a much more scholarly project, but nevertheless, it also had to engage with this question of what it meant to be Australian, what kind of story it was going to tell about Australia. Now, it was influenced by Ramsden's own interests in the 19th century vocabulary. That is, while he did include some slang and what we might call slang or colloquialisms, although no labelling of slang, as we know, it nevertheless was very much about telling a story of a settler colonial society. Now, Bill was not unaware, I don't know if you can read that, but this was the media release that was put out. This was in the days before we had big PR companies who might have advised against using certain certain lines to talk about the dictionary. But I do love to bring this one out because the line that they ran with was something Bill said: Australian English provides evidence of Australian racism, sexism and inhumanity, of the Australian self-consciousness and insecurity of identity, but also reveals intention, pragmatism. They're holding up a sign, 5 minutes, I can't actually read the sign, but I can see the gesture. But also reveals intention, pragmatism, heroism and idealism and the emergence of a distinctive national character. So I think Bill did recognise that that settler colonial narrative came with its own particular baggage. I don't think a PR person a publisher would ever advise going with that line today if you wanted to sell copies. Needless to say, it didn't sell particularly well. But anyway, it was 1988. I think everyone was sick of the bicentennial by the time we got to the end of the year. It was published in December of 88. When Bruce Moore came to work on the second edition, which was published many years later in 2016, here he sought to tell an expanded story of Australia through an expanded vocabulary. So I won't go into a lot of details about this. Needless to say, I guess a couple of important things to say about the second edition. Twice as a page length, went from 10,000 vocabulary items to 16,000 vocabulary items, but importantly really acknowledged a greater diversity of kind of lexical items that were included, including a lot of slang and colloquialisms, and even more importantly, included a lot of information about the Aboriginal languages from which Australian English vocabulary items had been borrowed. So here was a story of Australia that was not rooted in its settler colonial story, but now recognised a broader and more diverse use of language. So I'm not going to have a lot of time to kind of get to the end of this. At the moment, we're working on a third edition, which will be online, open access, if we can get it out there. We are currently working on a number of entries. We've got about 3,000 possible new entries. But the issue I kind of want to just quickly engage with at the end of this is really what kind of story is it that we want to tell about Australia, and what is the relevance of kind of talking about Australian English today. The Australian English lexicon, of course, will always reflect the legacy of settler colonialism, of the racism, sexism, homophobia, and just about every other prejudice that has marked our history. But I do think there is value in using stories about Australian ways of using language, and here I want to put what we do on Australian English alongside the work that will be highlighted in the rest of this panel, the work that is being done on First Nations languages, the variety of Aboriginal Englishes, ethnolects, migrant languages, Australian Sign Language, and other ways of communicating in Australia, and importantly be seen as part of this broader language ecology that exists here in Australia. And I think we can find stories that allow us to think of new ways of imagining what it means to be Australian and what it means to be Australian in the world. And I think these opportunities rest in thinking about what the changes are in the nature of Australian English. It isn't just fossilised in the language of, Paul Hogan or Alf from Home and Away, although he tends, these tend to be the kind of stereotypes that come to mind. But to think about and to tell a story about Australian English that is constantly changing, that is discarding the words and expressions that perhaps no longer reflect our values or who we are, and how we take on new words to reflect new Australian realities. And so I'll just very quickly run through some of the new entries. I mean, importantly, we prioritise putting in First Nations voices through our quotations, but also through the diverse kind of range of words and expressions around First Nations activism, First Nations knowledge, ways of thinking about country, land and environment. More important than ever in a time, of course, of climate change. Thinking about, well, these are the more traditional areas, flora and fauna, but thinking about the way in which we use First Nations names for plants and animals, and changing place names as well, which is sort of beyond the remit of our dictionary, but I think it's part of that broader discussion around the kinds of words that we use. Reflecting the kind of social changes that Australia is undergoing. I know it's a bit of a something that people say, that multiculturalism is often expressed for Australians. They're most comfortable with talking about food, but it's true that is reflected in our lexicon. Continuing to think about what kind of social changes are reflected in our language, and being able to tell stories about these words. A lot of what I do is very public-facing. It's very much engaging the public in conversations about Australian English, but more broadly about the kind of society and culture that we live in. And I think also it's important to look at some of these kinds of expressions and to be really critical of them, the way politicians can politicise certain expressions. I mean, one of the words I put in my book, Australian 100 Words, was un-Australian, and how un-Australian has kind of been used to kind of label all sorts of things and being used in this very political way. Some of the, expressions that, I've got to finish up, some of the expressions that our politicians use, like quiet Australians, and Scott Morrison and the way he used those kinds of expressions to political ends, but being able to have critical conversations about why we use those words and why these words get traction, and being critical of them, and hopefully throwing them out at some point. The Australian National Dictionary and discussions around Australian English, I think, is one means, it's only one means amongst many others, of having these kinds of critical conversations for Australia, and to prompt reflections on language, identity, culture, society, politics and our nation. And I think these are conversations, as we've already talked about through the symposium earlier, these are conversations I think we desperately need in the current moment that we live in. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, our next speaker is James Walker. James is the Professor of Diversity, Language Diversity at La Trobe Uni, but he'll have something to say about that, I imagine. his research area is in, in really interesting things that happen in language context. So when languages, or rather speakers, kind of bump up against each other and the fallout of that. So he's best known for his work in large urban centres like Toronto and Melbourne, but he has, published widely looking at change and variation in, a range of different settings and varieties of English, but other languages as well. James also established and has hosted for many years the Forum for Englishes in Australia at La Trobe University. So he is well equipped to answer the question, who speaks Australian English? James.
Thank you. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and acknowledge pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. How does this work? Okay, so some people have talked about this already. Lucky Country goes back to 1964. It's interesting when I tell people that I'm going to be talking about the Lucky Country, they think, oh, this is a great compliment. But actually, what am I doing? Oh, can I go back? But I think he intended it as a wake-up call for Australia because of what he perceived as the complacency, bad management, and reliance on the UK and the USA. There's surprisingly, although I put a question mark here because given the dominance of English in Australia historically, maybe it's not that surprising, but surprisingly there are a few comments about language in the book, and Amanda's already touched on this one about the fact that much of the Australian language is simply city slang or provincial idiom, or even thieves' camp brought over from England during the settlement. He also says at one point, though, that London-oriented Australians laugh at what he called the Australian accent. It's important to note that the composition of Australia's population has changed quite a bit since he wrote the book. So this is taken from a recently published chapter with some colleagues where we looked at the sources of migration to Australia from the Second World War up until 2010. And it might be difficult to read this, but basically you see a predominance of British origins initially that shifts to other European origins, but within the last 20, 25 years has really shifted more towards India and China and other countries from Asia. So what this means then is that Australians in 2024 look and sound a lot different now than they did at the time that Horne wrote his book. Not that he was unaware of this, though. So he noted in his book the changing nature of the Australian population. He said Sydney has dozens of migrant communities where English at most is only a second language. And he says for the first time, a large segment of the Australian population is of non-British or non-Irish origin. What's interesting, though, is that most of the comments he's making are in the context of assimilation to Australian society. So he says Australians don't wish their nation to be a muddle of permanent national minorities. He talks about public standards of assimilability, of language, education, working capacity. He also noticed that British immigrants were much more likely to be assimilated, but that's because they spoke English, although not to Australian standards. And he notes specifically, he targets the Greeks for being the slowest assimilators of all, by which I meant he thinks that they kept apart and that they maintained their language and culture. So if we look at the notion of multilingualism and community languages, we're now in a situation where English coexists with a range of other languages. So of course, the Indigenous languages that were spoken before the arrival of the English, and also now community languages that are spoken by various migrant groups or descendants of migrants. So basically what this means is that nowadays, for many Australians, speaking more than one language is part of who they are. So in contrast to the sort of monolingual mindset that Horne was representing in his book, we see a very changing nature of the population. So if we look at, a lot of what I'm going to say is I'm focused on community languages. A lot of this can be said for Indigenous languages as well, but I'm going to focus on community languages. So these are the languages brought by non-English speaking migrants and sometimes maintained by their children and grandchildren. What's interesting is that the maintenance of a community language can help to build their sense of belonging to a community in Australia, and it also helps to connect them with their heritage and with their ancestral homeland. So I've been involved in a couple of projects recently in Melbourne, interviewing people in the Greek and Italian communities, and this is something that comes up often, is the people talk about the value that they place on being able to speak the language associated with their heritage. Oops, go back. It's supposed to have sound here.
Here being in Australia, obviously the mindset is obviously the English language is a lot more important. But my parents also found it really important for me to have that cultural identity and have that connection to my Greek background, which is why they decided to also allow me to learn a second language, which was the Greek language.
Okay, so you can see the Greek language is very important as a part of cultural identity. In another interview that we did with a middle-aged second-generation Italian-Australian man, he also talks about the value of being able to speak Italian.
98% of my day is with people that speak English. Like if at work I go to a client's house and I pick up that they're Italian, then I can break into Italian. I'll actually say something in Italian to let them know I can speak Italian, and maybe they feel more comfortable.
So we can see that there's value for people in being able to speak the language associated with their background. Now, there are various factors that go into being able to maintain a community language. Just sheer numbers is one of them. If you have more people who speak the language, you're more likely to maintain it. Geographic concentration, so if you live together with other people in the same area of a city. Endogamy is very important. If you marry someone from the same background who speaks the language, your children are more likely to be able to speak the language. Also, if there's local media like newspapers or radio, and then institutional support is very important, so community organization, churches, and schools. These have all been shown to be able to allow people to maintain a language. What often happens, though, is that if these supports aren't in place, there's a shift towards English, and this typically takes a generational pattern. So you get the first generation coming in, the migrants who may be monolingual or dominant in the community language. Second generation, their children are bilingual and they may be English dominant. And then by the third generation, they're often monolingual, although they may have passive understanding of the language. So people often talk about being able to carry on bilingual conversations with their grandparents where they can understand, but they can't necessarily produce the language. So what happens then when a community shifts towards English? Is that it? Do they lose their sense of cultural identity? Well, here's a case where we can look at the choices that people make when they speak and how that plays a role in being able to express who they are. Now, Amanda's already talked about the lexicon of Australian English. I'm going to be focusing more on the accent, the pronunciation of Australian English. So Australian English is said to lack the regional differences that are found in places like the UK. This isn't entirely true, but it holds to a large extent. And basically the differences are based more on considerations having to do with things like class, level of education, and an urban or rural split. And there are sort of three distinctions that are made in the accent. So one type of Australian accent is called broad, and this is the way that people like Steve Irwin and Julia Gillard speak. There's a general accent, so if you listen to people like Rebel Wilson and Chris Hemsworth, they tend to use a general accent. And then there's the more, what's called cultivated accent. And I was looking for some examples, so I guess Kate Blanchett and Jeffrey Rush would be probably at the more cultivated end. So think about, if you're trying to think these broad, general, and cultivated, think of these particular people. Now what's interesting is that in the late 70s, early 80s, Barbara Horvath, who just passed away unfortunately this year, did a survey of Sydney English where she was one of the first surveys of English that looked not just at the people of the Anglo-Celtic background, but also at people of other backgrounds like Greek and Italian background. Meanwhile, around the same time, maybe a little later, Michael Klein in Melbourne was looking at Melbourne English, and he was noticing differences in the English spoken by people of German background, Greek background, and other backgrounds. So this difference, so if we think about regional differences as being dialects, then we could call differences in how you speak according to your ethnic and linguistic background an ethnolect. So these are ethnically marked ways of speaking English. And one of the ongoing questions about this is whether these are transitional ways of speaking. So is this something that is carried on from the first generation who learned English as a second language and their children are carrying on with it, and eventually it's going to disappear? Or is this something that continues over generations and that people use to say something about who they are when if they don't speak the language anymore? And there's been a lot of media commentary on it, often negative, but there was a recent article at the beginning of this year in The Guardian that I was interviewed for, looking at a Western Sydney TikToker who uses what's called a sort of a West Sydney accent associated with the Arabic background population in that part of the city. And as he says here, it's an expression of identity. So in the article, they point out the fact that this is not some foreign feature that's been brought into Australian English. It's a construction of people who've grown up in Australia, and they use this as part of expressing their identity. So a more detailed study of this was done more recently by Catherine Travis, who's sitting in the audience here, called Sydney Speaks. And this was a large-scale project which took the data that Barbara Horvath had collected 45 years ago, but updated it with more recent data as well. So they have recordings with 204 Sydneysiders in 2 time periods. And this may be difficult to read, but they've got speakers of Anglo-Celtic background, Italian background, Greek background, and Chinese background. And they've been doing a lot of study of different features of accent or pronunciation. I'm not going to go into all the details of their analysis, but the main take-home message, and Catherine can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that they found that Greek and Italian teenagers in the 1970s were leaders in changes that were going on in the Australian English accent at the time. So rather than being passive recipients of the Australian English accent, they were actively contributing to it. They've also noted that there's a connection between features that are often perceived as ethnolectal, but actually have more to do with this consideration that we talked about before about class, about broad, general, and cultivated. So it's not so much a case that they are carrying on features that their parents picked up while they were learning English. They're picking up on this distinction within Australian English of these more broad versus cultivated types of speaking. A similar project has also been going on by Felicity Cox, I don't think she's here today, called Voices of Sydney. So in this project, they recorded 184 teenagers from schools in 5 areas of Sydney that are different in terms of the language backgrounds that predominate in each of the communities. Their main research findings was that children, regardless of background, that grew up in more diverse areas were more likely to pick up on these language changes that are going on in Australian English. And interestingly, they found out that the individual children or teenagers were behaving similarly regardless of their language background. So whether they were Arabic background or Greek background or Italian background, they were all behaving very similarly, which suggests that it's not simply a case of transfer from their community language or from their parents or grandparents. This is something that's going on more generally in Sydney. Okay, so basically what this means is that any child who grows up in Australia is going to speak Australian English. But what's interesting is a child who also learns an ethnolect then has a way of shifting between different ways of speaking English. So in a way, it's almost like being able to speak another language. So just as if you can speak more than one language, that gives you an extra linguistic resource, being able to speak in more than one accent also gives you an additional resource. And for children and grandchildren of migrants who haven't maintained the community language, the ethnolect gives them a connection to the community and heritage. So there's a more recent project that I've been involved with a number of people, one of whom is in the room, Janet Fletcher, where we've been trying to see whether or not people can actually identify someone's background on the basis of the way they speak. So we did an online survey. The QR code is still active. We're not collecting data, but if you want to participate in the study or listen to what we did, you can look at take a picture of the QR code. And basically, we just give them 9 disembodied voices like this.
I was driving and this guy was moving into my lane without indicating or anything, and despite the fact that I'm actually there. So he was really just trying to push me out of the way.
So we asked people if they could identify, is this person Anglo, Greek, Italian, Chinese, etc., and a bunch of other questions about, do you think they're from Australia? Do you think they speak English well? And what was interesting was, what we found was that listeners are actually not very good at identifying a person's background. They got it right less than 50% of the time, so less than chance. What is also interesting is that regardless of what the person's background actually was, if they believe that that person was a more recent migrant from one of the groups that's more recently migrated to Australia, they tended to judge that person as not being Australian and not to speak English well. So this suggests that the ethnolects are largely based on perceptions of difference rather than the actual differences that exist in the way people speak. So if we go back to Donald Horne's book, Donald Horne was coming in prior to the advent of official multiculturalism. But what's interesting about multiculturalism, and this came up in the earlier panel, was the fact that it really gives Australians the opportunity to put together parts of who they are. So this involves things like culture and religion and food, while they remain Australian. So we can basically look at this multilingualism, being able to speak more than one language, and ethnolex as another facet of multiculturalism. So this is part of the merging of social identities that's taking place in 21st century Australia, which is quite different from what was the situation when Donald Horne wrote his book. And basically what's happening is that the definition of what it means to be Australian is expanding, and language is part of this. And I thought it was interesting, I bought the book recently, and they had a number of prefaces from the various editions, and in the 5th edition he has this comment which I think is very appropriate, which says that maintaining social cohesion means acknowledging differences, not trying to suppress them, and looking for ways in which people can live together despite those differences. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. So our next speaker is Joe LoBianco. Joe is Professor Emeritus at the University of Melbourne. He's the International Secretary of the Academy of Humanities, and he was our president, I don't know how many years ago, long time ago. Joe specialises in policies related to multilingualism and to social conflict and social cohesion. What some of you may not know is that Australia was the first Anglophone country to have an explicit languages policy. So Australia's 1987 national policy on languages is due to Joe. More recently, Joe has been looking at the capacity of language to solve conflict. So he has been helping to create language and education policies to in places that have been embroiled in conflict for decades. So Joe's work really does make a very big impact on people's lives. Now his title is It's Best Made in Bed, Donald Horne's Sense of Difference. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Kate. This will be the reassuringly third PowerPoint that you'll experience. And I'll just check that I've understood how to do this. Yes, I'm going to be talking mostly about Donald Horne's theory of assimilation. And it's summed up perfectly in this expression, it's best made in bed. It's about the melting of migrants. And I'm going to contrast basically his sense of it and the American meltingness, and they've done it very well. So this is chapter 3 of the Senses of Difference in the Lucky Country book. And it's an interesting chapter. The 5 pages I'm mostly obsessed with are like, I describe them here, a cabinet of curiosities. He runs us through all of these. It's like, you know, the Borges novels about the emperor's zoo, and the categories in this are completely unlike each other. City dwellers, bushies, wowsers, snobs, women, Catholics, the underprivileged. Suddenly we get all these breakthroughs in art and culture, which don't seem to fit with all the problems, and architecture, and then we get the migrants. And these are 5 pages devoted to asking how well migrants are assimilated, or more importantly, telling us how well he thinks they could be assimilated and through what mechanism. The interesting thing is this contradiction at a certain point where he talks about how well educated so many of the migrants are. He's talking really about displaced persons from Eastern Europe at this point. 2/3 of the research staff at the CSIRO were immigrants, etc. But he does note that neither languages nor ethnicities were honoured. So the sense that he has, and he just expresses it there and in another part of the book, that Australia has managed to be an immigrant country for most of its history without even thinking about it. And unlike the US, and this is really a very powerful part, I think, of his reasoning, it does not imagine itself that way, as certainly not as a haven of the oppressed and a market for the talents of the world, even though it is attracting them. So the Lucky Country imagines an Australian version of this melting pot because, I think James already said this, Australians do not wish their nation to be a muddle of permanent national minorities. Obviously the language choice there is very significant, a muddle. And assimilation is best made in bed, and this is never elaborated in any way. So these sections of it would have been interesting had he gone there. It's, in a way, this part of the book which has the least coherence with the Australia of today, I think, or certainly one of them. And I want to contrast that to Noel Pearson's sense of the three sensibilities a bit later and the classic American melting pot. And to do this, part of my interest in the US, of course, is I did my PhD there. I was at Johns Hopkins University and based in Washington, D.C. And I interviewed a lot of people in Congress. And one day I had exactly this experience. I was interviewing this congressman, and at the end of the interview, they were all incredibly polite, even when they were saying shocking things. And I asked him about the experience of migration, because I'd been to Ellis Island, like many migrant background people. You trace your ancestry there, and on both sides of my family, the Ferraros and the Lobiancos, had migrated to the US. He closed his eyes, he literally looked up, and then he declaimed Emma Lazarus's 1883 words. He literally said, not looking at me, looking up to the skies, he said, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." He then opened his eyes and looked at me and escorted me out. So I don't think that would happen in Australia. So I became very interested in Emma Lazarus, and she turns out to be a remarkable individual. And when you go to Ellis Island, or to the Liberty Island, you see the statue, of course, and this sonnet from which those words are taken is now inscribed there. It was put on there 6 years after she died, or after she wrote the words. And she turns out to be a fascinating and important individual who assisted Eastern European Jews escaping pogroms from there, and gives life to this incredible, uplifting and lofty discourse around America as a haven. But I think there's another point of difference with the United States that's worth mentioning before I go back to Australia, and that is the question of the melting pot, which doesn't come from her so much, but really from John Hector St. John, who in 1782 wrote these things, letters from an American farmer, which I read in the Congressional Library. And this particular sentence or phrase, "Individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labours and posterity will one day cause great changes to the world." And we can certainly concur that he was right in that prediction. As a metaphor for nationalities and ethnicities merging and losing their distinctiveness, there's really been no more powerful concept ever imagined. And of course it takes its zenith point almost in Israel Zangwill's play in 1908 called The Melting Pot, and I'll quote something from that in just a minute. So the combination of Lazarus's hordes and the sympathy and the lantern and the whole way in which actually in the poem you can see she contrasts a classic Greek statue and its semiotics with the Statue of Liberty. You get this really deep-rooted American sense of themselves, which, of course, is there implicitly in Donald Horne's sense of what we don't have. So this is the section from Zangwill's play. David, I won't read this in great depth, but it's David who's a victim of oppression, Vera, his lover and ultimately partner, whose father is involved in the perpetration of this oppression and then ultimately their reconciliation. But it's basically a metaphor for the United States. And you can see there, particularly the expression where he talks about how people will be melted into a new, unique thing. At the very end there, "Ah, Vera, what is the glory of Rome and Jerusalem, where all nations and races come to worship and look back, compared to the glory of America, where all races and nations come to labour and look forward." So I think that it's interesting to move then to a consideration of what's behind the thinking of Donald Horne, and I think it's captured very well in Melanie Cheng's piece in Mianjin in 2016, where she talks about how in the same sections that Horne is describing what it is like to be an Australian, we get the mention of the un-Australian. In other words, the opposite or the antipathy of it. I won't read it, but it's there for you to see in that issue of it. But it's really important how she contrasts the reality, the demographic reality of hers as a Chinese Arab mixed family and all of the kinds of multi-faith interactions and linguistic interactions that constitute a new kind of Australianness that was not anticipated there, but is brought into life through its negativity, its un-Australianness. In there, and I think James has already mentioned this, there are two mentions of how really slow the Greeks are to assimilate. I'm looking at a few people right now. So the irony of this is that he ranks assimilation by speed. It's actually an interesting course of study. James mentioned the three-generation pattern of language loss, and Greeks tend to be in the fourth, maybe fifth sometimes. But interestingly, he doesn't foresee the actual catalytic role that the Greeks and Italians played in crafting the multicultural policy of the 70s that actually undid a lot of what he was describing. It's also ironically true that in 1927, J.S. Ling's non-Britishers and Australians also poked at the Greeks as being the least popular foreigners. So how did this Australian multiculturalism that overturned so much of Donald Horne's sense of the lack of loftiness in Emma Lazarus's terms, or the melting pot in the US, how did it come into play, and why is it, in my opinion, significantly superior to the American version? Well, I think it was brought into practice through three mechanisms that are almost boring to talk about. But they're not boring, actually, they're incredibly important. The first one is compulsory voting, which I think is a magnificently productive vehicle of Australian public life. Compulsory voting, I strongly support it. Belgium is another place that does this, but I don't think it served them as well. The second thing, and this is less true than it used to be, but still relatively true, relatively liberal citizenship pathways. And these two things combined produce something quite unique, I think even unique compared to Canada. The existence of economic discrimination and the tightening of the post-war secondary labour market meant that in the late 60s and early 70s, compulsory voting and relatively liberal citizenship laws meant that migrant grievances got on the discourse of politicians. I attended some of these things, that's how old I am. And the emergence of articulate second-generation children of post-war migrants that meant that these became an agenda item. But what was especially unique was that the conservative side of politics in Australia bought into the same story, especially with Malcolm Fraser. So we had, you can see this also in Nathan Gardner's writing on Chinese and Japanese challenges to the White Australia policy, the really pragmatic way in which grievance comes to become a political problem for politicians who then create policies that are pragmatic. So it's not lofty, it's not poetic, and it's not a melting pot, but it does produce pragmatic policy change, which I think has been very positive for our country. And I think you can see this in some scholarship. Jean Martin, I think, deserves a great deal of credit for her innovation in this. In 1953, not the year of my birth, although it really was the year of my birth, actually, went to live in a migrant hostel among displaced persons. And there, and in the town where this hostel was located, she described pain, bewilderment, suspicion, and fear. And then, very importantly, methodologically, very innovative for this period of time, she locates many of these same people in the town, although they'd moved to other states and so on, and took a note of their views and their sense of what still was being called assimilation. So in her illustrious career, I think Jean Martin's what I would call compassionate and innovative work exposed both the persistence of neglected problems and laid the basis of social change. I can't develop it now, but I think she was Dovey, Margaret Whitlam's father-in-law, was involved with the first lot of investigations into the failure of the generation of children that my peers who went to school, who were completely not taught and supported in English, but were able to be absorbed into the secondary labour market, which they later became impossible. So the work of these people in focusing on really pragmatic, concrete problems placed these on the agenda of the Commonwealth Government at a time when the states refused to do anything about it, and so the Commonwealth Government developed its own sense of interest in education, which it never had done before. So along these, we need to also acknowledge Charles Price and other people. They researched what I think we could describe less loftily as cultural blending or mixing, unlike the melting pot ideology, very much more pragmatic, but away from normative Britishness to a uniquely Australian way to do new citizenship without the privilege of ancestry. I mentioned some other individuals. I just won't even talk about them. They're on the slide, but they've done really significant work in reintroducing a critical perspective to multicultural studies in Australia, which got denuded by the celebratory air that followed the Fraser-Whitlam compact. I call it a compact. They disagreed on probably on that as well, because Fraser gave it a culturalist element, Whitlam gave it a class base, but nevertheless they both endorsed the same policies. And that is quite unique. So within language policy, which has been my main area of interest, this lack of loftiness is also found. I'm just going to read these very, very quickly if you're interested in them. They're all from my writing, so I'll lecture you at great length about how insightful they are. I regard the first period of time as Britishism, and it has these characteristics. It's interesting from Amanda's point. I think a lot of it was drawn from my analysis of the dictionary and its content. Southern British norms of English, repression of Indigenous and immigrant languages, the promotion of elite languages typical or appropriate to British geography, etc. And so the role of language issues often neglected in the consolidation of a Britishist identity and loyalty. I don't know, there are a lot of historians here. The last people I should insult are historians or criticise, but I would like them to pay more attention to questions of language. And this is contested, and I think Donald Horne represents a significant part of this, by what I call an Australianist alternative. It's not multicultural and not even sympathetic, particularly to multiculturalism, but it is a contestation of the Britishism, and we heard very nicely from Amanda about that. And then out of this dynamic that I mentioned before, a multicultural alternative that values community languages and Indigenous languages, and I contest the view of some people who say that there was no collaboration between the Indigenous and immigrant, because I think there really was in the 70s and 80s. And then this is overturned by what I call Asianism, which is very strongly comes to the fore with Kevin Rudd and also Keating, and then is undone by John Howard, who asserts English again, but not English in a... There's definitely a nostalgic air to his reassertion of it, but it's mostly what I call neoliberal economism around the export of Australian services, education. So Noel Pearson's version of these things, which I think is significantly helpful in relation when we read Donald Horne. I've got 10, 15, 20 minutes left. He identifies these three, well, I call them constellations. He doesn't use such a snooty term, but he calls them the ancient heritage, our British inheritance, and the multicultural triumph. So you can see there at least that he's injecting this, the celebratory edge to it. And in his Boyer lectures in 2022, these three culturally constitutive forces of the polity are argued as three heritages or principles. Very close to here, Eric Wilmot in 1988 said to me, Australia consists of the three I's, the Indigenes, the invaders and the immigrants. And it's about time that the first and the third I got together more carefully, and I think that... So this takes us to what actually Anne Curthoys described as an uneasy conversation. There are far too many immigrant advocates don't take enough attention of the Indigenous and colonial history of the country. She makes this criticism in the 2000 in the wake of the Pauline Hanson work. I want to say that at least in the language area, this is far less true. We've done far better. There's been much more collaboration because both groups, though with different levels of consequence and seriousness, have been involved with the same set of cultural loss. So these destabilise the binary of colonising and colonised experience. I think this is my last slide. Yes, it is. So I think I'm finished there. Thank you very much.
I think you made it in time, Joe. Yeah, thank you. So have we got our next speaker, Jackie Troy? She's in Glasgow at the moment, so I think it's 3:30 in the morning for Jackie. Is that right, Jackie? Is it 3:30? Yes, well done.
Am I online? Can you see me?
So Professor Jackie Troy she heads the Indigenous Research Hub. She's Director of Indigenous Research at Sydney University, and she's also in the Linguistics Department there as well as an academic. So Jackie wears a number of hats. She's very well known for her work in language policy and also particularly in developing the national curriculum for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. She's a Ngarigu woman and passionate about, of course, preserving Indigenous voices, making sure they're heard loudly and clearly. And for this work, I should add, she was actually recognised in 2019 as among the top 100 most influential women of the time. So please make Jackie welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. So can people hear me? Is that, yeah? Hello, can people hear me? Yeah? You can hear me there. Yeah. Okay,
Loudly and clearly.
excellent.
Very
So-
well. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you, Kate, for your introduction. And I'll use a traditional Scottish greeting that I elicited from the workmen outside the hotel I'm staying in, which is hello. I did expect it to be something more like Gaelic, Shlanta or something, but no, it's hello. So I thought that's quite a wake-up call to me about the pervasiveness of English, and it's where I guess I would start. I was looking through works about Donald Horne, and I found that the Scotsman Eric Bogle, the Scottish singer, wrote this song, Hard, Hard Times. It's hard times in the lucky country, hard, hard times. And he was singing about how it was for Aboriginal people in the lucky country. And I would say that that's still a pretty good assessment. It is hard, hard times for most of us, particularly if you want to be a champion of our languages. And one of the things that really distresses me, I believe, is that Australia, it's actually hard, hard times for languages generally. I think all of our speakers today have raised that, Joe most particularly right now. If you speak anything other than English, it's really not valued very highly. We have an Australian curriculum where you can study, I think, at least 72 languages. When I was designing the framework for Aboriginal languages and Torres Strait Islander languages for teaching these languages in our schools with other scholars, Michael Walsh in particular, I was exposed to all the other curriculum development that was happening with Angela Scarino leading that. And I thought to myself at the time, all these amazing languages that you can study in our schools, but how many schools are really able to support students to become even lightly bilingual? And how many schools value the languages that people who come with other languages bring to those schools? We still have this domination of English, and as we've heard today, in its kind of three varieties. I mean, of course, there are more really, but it's quite an extraordinary thing. Australia has always been a multilingual country since the British invaded in 1788. The First Fleet officers alone, most of them spoke up to 12 languages. They'd all seen action in India, as it was, and in the Americas. They had been around the world. They were exposed to the Indigenous North American languages. They were normal. It was just normal for people who were educated English in the late 18th century and into the 19th century to be able to speak multiple European languages as well as ancient Greek and ancient and Latin. So it was a multilingual space that the British who came to Australia came from, but somehow that seemed to have gotten lost. And of course, most of the first convicts who came to Australia were Irish speaking. And I wrote about that back in the 1980s and 1990s and sort of locked horns with Bill Ramsden a bit because of my view that actually Australian English was much more influenced by Irish-speaking people, Irish first language speakers of Irish whose English was pretty poor if they spoke any English at all. People forget that that's actually the demographic that came to Australia in the very earliest period, the so-called convicts, you know, the transported people. And this had a huge impact actually on the Aboriginal population. I wrote a small paper for a conference that was held at Trinity College in Dublin about an Irish English and Irish language and its influence on the Aboriginal population of early Australia, as it's known now. And I was really interested in how much engagement there was between Irish people in particular and Aboriginal people. It's not surprising, most people were Irish. So the Aboriginal community took on a whole lot of Irish, English and Irish attributes. So it's pretty normal for Aboriginal people to talk about things being deadly, meaning that it's great, wonderful, marvellous, not that it will kill you. People will say, I'm going to kill you. Aboriginal people used to use this term and get into trouble even in the very earliest periods of British government in Australia. But actually what they were doing was using it in the way that the Irish use that term, I'll kill him, meaning I'll give him a really good beating. So many things came into the Aboriginal languages lexicon from Irish and Irish English, and of course our Australian accent. Donald Horne was quite wrong in his disparaging remarks about Australia. Really the influence of English of England was pretty limited in the early period because, as I said, people were mostly Irish, and I guess the register that we owe most of our sound to in Australia now is Slum Dublin. This was pointed out to me by Donald Laycock, who was one of my supervisors when I was doing my PhD at the Australian National University, who was very interested. He said, if you want to hear what Australian English, where the origins of Australian English comes from, listen to Shakespeare as she was spake. And if you listen to Shakespeare, particularly read by people from Slum Dublin, it sounds very like Australian English. And if you listen to the films, The Commitments and The Snapper, which are very famous Irish films based in Slum Dublin, it's like listening to Australian English even now. So this was what Aboriginal people were exposed to. Australia was always a multilingual place. It was very multilingual before the British invaded. We had at least 407 Australian languages, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, and of those only about somewhere between 13 and 15 are still spoken right through every day for every purpose, so what we call in linguistics strong languages. This is a shocking legacy. So we Aboriginal people were made to feel ashamed of speaking our languages, embarrassed by speaking our languages. People of my mother's age, she's turning 96 in a couple of days actually, and she remembers a time she did not grow up speaking her own language, but she knew some words, but she carries this sort of fear that if we perform ourselves as Aboriginal people and are obviously Aboriginal publicly, that we will be shamed and that we have a lot to fear from that. And, this is an ongoing fear. There's no doubt we are still attacked for our identities and shamed for being who we are. The failure of the referendum last year, I think, was one of Australia's greatest shames, and the fact that we don't have a voice in our constitution, or indeed really have a public voice, is something that is quite staggering. It's like Trump winning in the United States. So I do think it is a lucky country. I travel the world a lot, and I deal with Indigenous communities all over the world. In particular, I've been working in northwest Pakistan, which is fabulously beautiful, and the people are extraordinarily kind to me and welcoming. They treat me as the Indigenous person I am, and welcome me into their communities. But they live with terror. You know, they're surrounded by people who have been militantized by the United States government, by their own government. You know, to be an Indigenous person in the north of Pakistan is a fearful thing. But it's no less fearful here. We are still treated as outsiders, outcast refugees in our own country. We share a lot in common with all these waves of people who've come to Australia from elsewhere who speak other languages and then are made to extinguish those languages, are made to feel embarrassed and to feel that they're never going to get ahead if they don't acquire English. So I admire very much Joe's work on attempting to create a more equitable Australia, of bringing in government policy that might support multilingualism, that would value this treasure trove of languages. Imagine if Australia capitalised on what it has. 407 Australian languages. A lot of these languages, the positive I will say in all of this is that are coming back into use again. It's not such hard times for our languages anymore. We can teach them in schools as a language subject. Maybe into the future we will be able to teach them as, we'll teach in our languages again. That was another terrible thing that happened in Australia, is that back in about 2009, thanks to the intervention and the development of a NAP plan system that demonstrated that children in the Northern Territory were not acquiring English at a nationally required rate, even though the programs for language teaching in the Northern Territory were very progressive and scaffolded children into English and taught them up to year 5, particularly in their own languages, in the Australian languages that they spoke. That education system was shut down. All those years of not just bilingual but multilingual education, a wonderful experiment in the Northern Territory. You know, fancy teaching people in the languages they actually speak. I was thinking about Joe's comment about not being able to be taught in your own language. I see this all over the world. Indigenous communities having to bow to the state and whatever the state language is, and being educated in the state language rather than the languages they actually speak, which means that they really don't get educated. Of course, it's a no-brainer. You teach someone in a language they can't speak, you're just yapping at them, basically. So in Australia, we had this wonderful program of multilingual education in the Northern Territory, honouring the languages, the Australian languages, these great treasure troves of knowledge that we have in our languages, and now that doesn't happen. I look forward to the day when you'll walk into an Australian school and everybody will be naturally speaking multiple languages, which is absolutely what we can do in Australia. Most Australians do have a non-English speaking background. And now, thanks to the huge waves of migration we've had since World War II. And I'm really pleased to say that. Imagine if the Irish-speaking people who came to Australia didn't have the Irish beaten out of them, which is what happened right from the start. Anybody speaking another language, beaten. In fact, 2 young men, I believe one of them was the first person executed in Australia. He was flogged to death, and his comrade who was speaking Irish, who were believed to be talking sedition. The British were terrified of Irish language, then terrified of our languages, those Aboriginal people, but also seditionary, and marrying up literally with the Irish. I love Gary Foley's term shamrock blackfellas. That's kind of what I am, but I have an English ancestor as well. So, but it's this fear of people speaking anything other than English, especially publicly. And that if you're speaking another language, you may be plotting against the state. So, and then this is a thing that I see, as I said, worldwide, Indigenous communities forced to sort of bow to the state and the state language. So, and this is one of the reasons why our treasure trove of languages worldwide is depleting. There are terrible statistics that I hear all the time of the world's 6,000 or 7,000 languages reducing by sort of 50 languages a year or more. And so in fact, even at an increasing rate. So along with climate change, we have language change. The diversity of our linguistic diversity is reducing. So we are reducing as humans, the state systems that we sit underneath, we suffer under, are actually, instead of valuing diversity, including human diversity, social diversity, linguistic diversity, climate diversity, environmental diversity, we've created this world where there's going to be this heating up climate that impacts everywhere and turns everywhere into one kind of environment. And at the same time, we are heating up the social world, the linguistic world, and melting it down into just a few languages, just a few monocultural forms. So it's not only the physical environment, the other than human, that we have to worry about. We are reducing ourselves. And I think it's time that Australia had a truly multilingual policy, and that our Australian Indigenous languages can thrive in that multilingual environment. We're getting there. The Australian curriculum is a great start. I urge everybody who can to ask why their local school isn't teaching an Aboriginal language or a Torres Strait Islander language. Many of them are, but get behind us. Let's hear it for linguistic diversity, and let's move into not only a multicultural but a multilingual society, a truly multilingual society where every Australian can proudly say that, like most of the rest of the world, we can speak more than one language. So with that, I will stop, and I will say yara in my own language, which normally means I'm off, but I'm going to hang here and listen to the end of the session. Thank you very much for indulging me from Glasgow.
Thank you so much, Jackie, particularly as it's 3:30 a.m. Well, I suppose a little later now. That was all terrific. Thank you to all of the presenters, and we've got a good bit of time, I think, for questions and discussion. And we've got roving mics. Some questions. There are always questions on language, so. While you're thinking, I'll just mention, James, I remember you mentioned Steve Irwin. I was at a very interesting talk. He'd come to the attention of a number of Swiss linguists who decided to put his vowel sounds through a test to see what they were like. And in fact, he didn't speak broad Australian at all. He spoke general Australian with just, I think with the exception of one diphthong that was quite striking. So it was a perception of broadness that was brought on by his, I suppose the fact that he said words like crikey and he wrestled crocodiles. And so people heard, so much like you were saying about the perception of accents. So have you thought of questions? Yes, there's a question here. Frank's got one. And the next one
there. Thanks, that was a wonderful session. This is really for anyone, James and Joe, probably more your area. Is there any evidence that, I suppose the discourse of assimilation, the policy of assimilation, that was, quite aggressively sort of pursued really by Australian governments during the 50s and 60s, actually affected sort of migrant choices about how they used language? I mean, I know personal anecdotes are often pretty useless in these situations, but I mean, my parents were, Australian-born children of Italian migrants, and were very hostile to the idea of speaking too much Italian at home. They were both fluent, but they believed that it detracted from your kids' English, that it would somehow be a disadvantage. They were both children of the Second World War, so they were in Australia during the Second World War with all that meant, all that meant if you were Italian background. My mother's family were enemy aliens. So I'm just wondering, did that sort of language and policy of assimilation actually sort of affect, or do we know of any, sort of work on that sort of impact, I guess, on the choices that were made?
Yes. There's we don't have direct evidence of that period of time because it wasn't researched very much. But when you contrast the choices that people typically make now and the choices that people typically made then, there's a really direct, I think, explanatory connection. And I have to say that in the US, in particular, the Ford Foundation was in the forefront of the linguistic assimilation, and they did it brutally in workplaces. But there's many examples of children. I mean, this is true in every colonial situation in a brutal way. I was just in Taiwan recently with a colleague from Wales who has collected all these pictures of the ways in which Welsh children were brutally punished for speaking Welsh. Well, we didn't have that experience within the immigrant account, but there's certainly multiple experiences, including in my own school, of kids being seriously punished for ranging outside of English, and unquestionably that gets back to the family, and parents want to protect their children from that kind of thing, so they keep them away from that risk. If you look at it now, it's a complete opposite. I think in many ways Australia does, I think Jackie was saying this too, does exceptionally well globally. I think our governments right now have got very little idea that multilingualism is the literacy of the 21st century, and we are risking, I think, significant cultural isolation and loss of innovation and exploration and other positive things. And the idea that there used to be, and it started in Nebraska in the 1920s, the idea that if you taught children in a language other than English before they were 5, they would be deeply disloyal to the country. It was litigated in a case, and the judge came down and said to the pastor in this German Lutheran school, this is the same time this Victoria and South Australia are legislating to close the German schools in South Australia and in Western Victoria, change the names of streets and towns. So we're doing exactly the same thing at the same time. But in the US, because everything is litigated, you have explicit statements of the reason why these things happen. And this judge said, and a case is called Maya v. Nebraska, he said that if you get a child before 5 in a foreign language like German, they will never be truly American. So this sense is a really deep-rooted idea that early language learning and bilingualism in children makes them either schizophrenic or disloyal or something or other, when we know the mountains of cognitive and other evidence is the complete opposite. So yeah, I think the popular sense of these things often becomes actually quite brutal as a way of punishing kids who stand out.
This on? Yeah. One of the things that's emerged from the interviews that we've been doing with Greek and Italian communities in Melbourne is that you don't even have to have an official policy. So with the first generation, they would typically send their kids to Greek school, for example, but the second generation decided not to send their own kids to Greek school because they felt such shame from the other non-Greek kids about having to go to these classes outside and on the weekend and things like that. So even though there wasn't necessarily an official policy, there was a lot of social stigma attached with speaking another language. The other thing, there was a recent thing I saw recently where there was someone was being told by a school teacher, and this is like within the last few years, not to teach their kid to speak the other language because that would confuse them, that would inhibit their academic achievement. And as Joe said, we know that's simply not true, that actually there are cognitive and academic benefits to speaking more than one language. So I have no doubt that official policies of assimilation affected people's choices, but I think also equally there are unofficial societal pressures on people to not speak other languages.
I have a question here and then there.
I do have a question. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'll just add briefly on that to what James and Joe were just talking about. My dad's first generation Dutch migrant, and I think that shame of not your language, the language you speak at home is not recognised or valued. You end up at school without any ESL. His name was changed twice to try and fit in better with the English speaking, and he's from a family of linguists. They all speak many other languages. So yeah, that language didn't come down to us either, or not enough of it. My question's actually about the different Australian accents, so the broad, general, cultivated kind of classification. Is there work on those being something that people switch between? I haven't seen any work on that, but I think that happens whether you call it code switching. Maybe not, but...
Yeah, you could call it code switching, or it's often called style shifting, if you're shifting between different styles of the same language. And off the top of my head, I can't think of any specific studies, but it has been shown that if you put people in different contexts, they are able to switch between the different levels. There's also this is based, I think, on the Mitchell and Delbridge classification from the 1950s, but there's been some evidence to suggest that this is a kind of an oversimplified view of the way the accents work, and that there's quite a bit more variability and more of a spectrum between these. And as we just heard with Steve Irwin, it's the case that you might use one particular feature of that accent, but not other particular features. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this. It's just been so interesting so far. Just on what Joe was saying about the relationship between migrants and Indigenous communities and sort of language and learning there. My parents, who were Greek migrants, spent, analogies with your family, Frank, but mine grew up in World War II and the Civil War. When they moved to Australia, because of the racism they faced, they spent time with the Gadigal and the Bidjigal people down at La Perouse. And that was their sort of first understanding of broader First Nations and Australian culture. There's a PhD researcher, Daphne Arapatis, at the University of Melbourne, and she's now embarking on a study of the relationship between Greek Australian migrants and First Nations communities. My question's about language and early education. In my first Australian primary school, between what we used to call little lunch and big lunch, we were divided up into our first languages and we were taught the curriculum in that language. Now, I soon moved to a different primary school and they didn't do that. And my sense was, this country's fantastic, what a great idea. And then I went to this different school where I was one of the only multilingual children, and I remembered just not being able to understand how the other children could form thoughts in their minds without having more than one language. I was deeply confused. Now, in my first public school, that program was called the Community Languages Program, and I wonder if there have been longitudinal studies about this, because I'm not aware of it. And yeah, I'd love to find out more, because it was quite thorough and quite a great program.
Well, the general question of bilingualism and cognitive function is massively well researched, and there's great work from Ellen Bialystock in Toronto about the bilingual brain, and really interesting research from the in countries with multiple bilingual populations and brain injuries of different kinds. You have a population-based research recovery from lesions and stuff. There's an overwhelming amount of research about the even in scientific reasoning. We know, for example, a big Spanish-English study in the United States about children's ability to reason about a hypothetical question in relation to astronomy or how tadpoles turn into frogs. And bilingual children are much more creative